My name is Rich Harrington, and welcome to this episode of Understanding Adobe Photoshop. Today, we're going to tackle camera RAW files. Now, RAW files are the native files recorded by your digital SLR camera, and you'll find these in professional and prosumer model cameras. The benefit of the RAW file is it's all the information that the camera sensor sees stored in a native file format. Unlike a JPEG or a TIFF, which must discard information before it's written to disk, the RAW file gives you a lot more information. And this essentially lets you develop the image when you open it inside of Adobe Photoshop. Let's explore the process. I've chosen and navigated to a RAW file, and I'll click Open. This particular file is from a Leica Deluxe camera. Notice the camera name appears in the menu bar there. There are multiple tabs and tools inside the camera RAW interface. Now, we can't tackle all of these, but I'm going to run you through the essentials. Be sure to fully explore the camera RAW interface as well as the accompanying help file with Photoshop to learn how every single button works. Once you open up the image here, you have a lot of controls starting off in the first tab, which is the Basic tab. You can choose different white balances for different sorts of temperature, such as daylight, cloudy, etc. And you see how the color balance quickly changes. I'm going to go with As Shot and trust the digital camera. I could then click Auto to adjust the exposure. And you notice that the exposure was boosted a bit to open up the exposure in the image, brightening it. You can also pull Recovery down to rescue any blown out areas such as sky or clouds, as we've done here. Conversely, Fill Light will brighten up dark areas like you see on top. And notice how we're essentially adding a fill flash to brighten that area. If you want more contrast in the blacks, you could pull that in. And there are also both brightness and contrast, which apply to the overall image globally. Typically, I reserve these and instead work with exposure, recovery, and fill light. But we could put a bit in. The next sliders really deal with color, and clarity, vibrance, and saturation work together to really help define detail and boost colors. As you boost clarity here, you'll see subtle details really start to come in, and this is best exemplified by viewing at 100%. So let's set this to 100% here and play with clarity, and you notice how we could really start to bring out some of the edges there. And vibrance will put more color in the image, particularly in areas of the image that don't contain skin tones. So if you boost saturation, notice how the clouds get beautiful, but the wood here is starting to look really orangey. Saturation has a tendency to boost oranges and reds too much, so instead you should balance that off with a little bit of a vibrance adjustment to go after non-skin tone areas. Our next tab is a tone curve, and this allows you to adjust individual parameters for highlights, shadows, darkness areas. I can go ahead and go after just the shadowy areas, as you see there, and it makes a nice adjustment there to the curve. Let's open up the highlights a bit. That looks pretty good. Our next tab is Detail, and this really allows you to fix up the image. Now, if we zoom in here, I want you to see that there's a lot of noise in this particular image. When you view this at 100%, you could really pick up the grain structure. Now, all images, whether they be film or digital, are going to have grain. You don't want to obliterate it, but you do want to do some noise reduction to remove away any color aberrations or noise aberrations that are non-desirable. We can go ahead and remove some luminance noise here, and as I start to pull that over, notice that this cleans up. I can also remove some color noise, and you don't want to go too far, but notice the changes there as we tweak a bit. And much of the noise is gone. Let's also look at the shadowy areas here, and notice as we crank that up, how noise is eaten away. Now, if you go too far, it starts to look like an illustration. So find the balance there between the first slider and the detail slider, which is going to preserve subtle edges. and that looks much better. You can always toggle it before and after to see the effects of removing the noise. And as you can see there, we've cleaned up quite a bit of aberration in the color and the shadowy details. Your next tab is for grayscale conversion if you want to go to a black and white. I typically do that elsewhere, but you can separately control saturation in particular areas. So for example, if I really want to boost the color of the sky, I could come down here to the blues and boost the saturation, and also do that a little bit in the aquas. And notice how the sky gets nice and richly saturated while the rest of the image is left alone. Our next tab is a split tone, and this really lets you go after the highlights and the shadows separately. So if I'd like to boost the blues in the highlights area, such as the sky region, I could do that. I could roll the hue here and increase the saturation, and notice how we can really change that, warming it up or cooling it down a bit further. Our next tab is lens correction, and this will remove chromatic aberration and fringing. And chromatic aberration is flaws in the color that you weren't expecting. Now, I saw some chromatic aberration up here in the dark shadowy areas. And again, you'll best see this when viewing at 100%. If I pull this over, some of the fringe will get cleaned up. That looks better, and we can actually remove some of the fringe on the edges. If you are getting a vignette caused by the lens hood, you can actually brighten or darken the edges with a lens vignette, but that's not stylistic. That's going to do the whole edge of the image to brighten or darken, often caused by the hood at the end of a digital SLR lens. Typically, I'll leave that set to 0 because I don't usually have that problem. Our next tab are effects, where you can add grain. So if you want to make the image grainier, you could put that in. And sometimes people will do that to age or stylize a photo. You can also adjust the post-crop vignette. So if you want to stylistically darken the edges down and play with sort of the midpoint there and how round it is, you can do that to square it out or round out the edges a bit, and a very big feather to get a nice soft transition. And you see that that creates a darker edge, sort of driving the viewer's eye towards the middle of the image. Now, you don't want to overuse those vignette effects, but they have grown very popular with photographers as a stylization tool. Our next tab includes camera calibration, and I highly recommend using the 2010 model. This newer method is much superior removal of noise and grain and does a great job. In fact, Adobe has put significant effort into improving this model for developing your raw files. And down here you can actually choose different camera profiles. I recommend standard in most cases. You can go after shadows and highlights. And our last area lets you make your own presets. So if you create a look that you like and you want to reuse it for other pictures, maybe shot at the same location or with the same camera model, you can click the paper icon here to make your own preset, choosing what settings you'd like to store and give it a name. The last tab also lets you store snapshots. So these allow you to create multiple versions. I can call this vignette, then go back into the Stylize tab here for effects and remove the vignette, setting that back to 0, and make another snapshot called plain. And now we can quickly toggle between the different preset looks. So that's a way to store more than one development setting with your raw file. Now, it's important to note that these files are not new files on the disk. Rather, there's a file of XMP metadata, or a sidecar file, that contains the instructions on what you want to do with this raw file. You'll also find several additional tools up top, including the ability to set a white balance or to go ahead and do targeted adjustments. For example, we can do a saturation adjustment on only a particular area here. And notice there how I'm going after just the sky. Or I could say, great, let's also do a parametric curve up here on this area, and we could brighten or darken that up a little bit. And that worked out very nice to selectively develop that. Got a little noisy down here, however, so we'll pull that down. And throughout the top, you'll find other options for cropping, straightening, and doing basic repairs to your image. There's a lot to the Camera Raw dialog box, and many of the tools that are in Camera Raw are also duplicated as adjustments inside of Photoshop. What I recommend is after you get the handle on doing color correction and toning, you revisit these tools in the Camera Raw dialog box when you have a sense of context. Being able to make adjustments inside of Camera Raw is a very flexible command. When you're ready and finish the image, you have two important choices. You could choose Done to store the image, or click Open Image to bring it into Photoshop. Once you open it, there's the file and it's added, and you notice that it did a very nice job. Now, some of that grain we were seeing at the bottom of the image isn't actually there. It got cleaned up upon development. And notice how we have a much nicer exposure up here in the top for the image itself. So, taking that extra effort inside of Camera Raw really gave us a great exposure. We were able to bring the clouds out, rescue that shadowy area, tweak the exposure in some very different areas, and get a much more attractive image than we had to start with.